books, textbooks, monographs, edited books, journal articles, how to make sense of all these different types of research publications. My guest and I are going to try to make sense of this in this episode of That's Academic. Welcome back to That's Academic. My name is Stephen Thomson, and if it's your first time here, please stick around and check out the other videos that we have on the channel in addition to this one. Now, in this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by my second guest on this channel, that is Dr. Sandra Marco Colino, an associate professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and a very experienced researcher. And she and I are going to be discussing the many different types of research publications which exist. And we're going to be looking at books, different types of books, chapters in books, journal articles. How are they different from each other? How do you choose, whether to write a textbook or a monograph? All of that is coming up. But just a quick word, I made an absolutely stupid mistake. I forgot to press record on my main mic input. So fortunately, Zoom was running in the background and it did pick up my audio, but my audio is definitely less than perfect. So I wasn't joking when I said this is a steep learning curve. What a stupid mistake. So I'm so pleased that we're joined by Dr. Sandra Marco Colino. She is an associate professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and she's joining me this week to talk about different types of research publication. Sandra, it's absolutely great to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Now, Sandra, one of the reasons why I've asked you to do this, and you've kindly agreed, is that you have authored lots of different types of research publications, right? You've got books, and you've got different types of books, within that. You have authored edited books, journal articles. For the benefit of people who might be looking into this, who are at the very earliest stages of their research careers, maybe PhD students, can you just give us a kind of introductory kind of run through of what these different types of research publications are and maybe how they're different from each other?
Absolutely. So I actually just realized not so long ago that I started my PhD 20 years ago. So I think I've published many different kinds of publications. I think it's mainly because of my age rather than any kind of merit. But yes, indeed, I think it's useful for early career researchers to understand the differences between these kinds of publications. I wish I had been told when I started out, so I hope this will be helpful. So first, of course, there are academic articles. And for us in law, we are normally talking about peer-reviewed or refereed journals, which is the same. So peer-reviewed and refereed journals are the same thing. And these are journals which send your work to other peers or to other academics with expertise on the topic on which you've written. And they will ask these academics for their opinion on what you have produced. And then on the basis of their reports, the journal will make a decision as to whether to accept the piece, reject, maybe ask you to revise and resubmit. And then, this is how the process goes. The other main option would be to submit to the US law reviews. They tend to be attached to the US law schools, and they're normally run by students. And the students are the ones who ultimately decide normally whether a piece gets accepted or not. And what I should say is it's a very different system, because normally you can submit to multiple journals at once, whereas peer-reviewed journals require exclusive submission. And they may also take quite a long time in making a decision, whereas the US law reviews tend to be quite fast. Now, what I should maybe say here is that you should aim for reputable journals. There is so much out there, even predatory journals. And you always sometimes get a clue by the publisher, if it's a reputable publisher, of course, or if the journal is attached to a reputable law school, then of course that is probably a good way to go. The second option, I would say the main option, would be writing a book, what we refer to as a monograph. And a monograph is really an opportunity to explore a topic in depth, a specific topic, maybe in relation to some jurisdictions, or maybe exploring the foundations of the subject. There are multiple options. So when you write a monograph, you're usually thinking of your peers, other academics, researchers that are writing a PhD, and you're hoping to really leave your mark on the future development of the subject. Third, I think another main option is, like you mentioned, textbooks. And when we write textbooks, we're thinking of our students, basically. And we need to cover every aspect of a subject briefly, in a didactic way, with many references to cases, to legislation, to guidelines, etc. And fourth, there are edited books, and you can either be a contributor to an edited book, writing a chapter, or you can be the editor yourself. And here is what happens is you might get an invitation from an academic, from another academic in another institution to contribute to a general topic, perhaps because you know a jurisdiction well, or because you know a specific aspect of that topic. And then different other authors would be asked to look at different aspects, and then that would come together as an edited collection. And finally, just maybe one more type, although it's not strictly speaking an academic piece, or I would say that we can also write sometimes in the press or in blogs. And this is normally a way to increase the impact of our research. So there might be something that we've come across that is helpful for the general public, and then we might just want to write a short piece that is accessible to everybody, explaining what we have discovered. I would say these are the main things we focus on.
Sandra, that's really a wonderful overview there of the different types of research publications. And I like the way you've separated out different types of books too, because that's something I would like to explore with you in a little bit more detail. One of the things that I would say is, I think you've written all of these different types of research publications, right? You attribute it to your age, but I would attribute it to other skills and dedication rather than that. One of the ones that I have not written out of those or kind of taken charge of is an edited book. So I've written sole authored books. I've contributed to other people's edited books and obviously written journal articles, but I have not actually taken charge of my own edited collection. Now, the reason for that, and this maybe opens up kind of avenue that we can explore, is that, and this situation will vary between different institutions, maybe different countries, but edited books have tended not to be counted at all in performance appraisals and kind of annual staff evaluations in institutions where I've been active. Now, I recognize that all of these different types of research outputs, have their own distinct contributions they can make to the field, to the literature, but also, as you well know, Sandra, we're all under a lot of pressure in terms of, making sure we do all of our teaching commitments, we perform all of our research duties and the admin side of the job. And we have to make sure that we meet expectations in all these different fields. Now, if time is short and resources are constrained, we might find ourselves actually not doing something or not doing as much of something simply because we don't feel that's, the most productive or the best use of our time, given the expectations we have to meet. So for me, given the demands placed on time and capacity, I'm just immediately disincentivized from trying to put together an edited book, because all the people I've spoken to who've done that say, actually, it's a lot of work. It's not just sticking your name on the front cover, far from it. And, my concern there is that I go into that, I lose control of timing, of course, in terms of when the publication comes out. But even if a good edited collection comes out at the other end, it actually seems to be virtually meaningless in some performance appraisals. I mean, do you think that's a real problem? Because you have actually gone on to put together edited collections. I just wonder what's your kind of take on that and the fact that they seem to be almost overlooked in some institutions' performance evaluations.
mean, I think you're right that normally faculties and universities don't give a lot of weight to edited collections. And this is something, of course, that we need to bear in mind, like you say. And certainly I would say, unfortunately, no matter how much you want to participate in an edited book or you want to edit your own book, if that's going to take up all your research time, then you need to maybe think twice about that. So especially if you are on the tenure track, and for those that are not familiar with this, it's effectively many universities will give you an opportunity to work for them for a number of years, and then they will assess your performance during that time, and then they decide whether they offer you a permanent contract or basically you might lose your job thereafter. So of course it's very important that you meet the requirements of the faculty that you're working for. I think that one of the main difficulties with edited books, for whether you are an author or whether you are the editor, is that sometimes authors do take their time sending you their chapters, which is of course very frustrating if you are the editor or you are another author and your chapter is being held hostage and not published because other authors have not submitted. And of course, you also have to understand that it's very difficult if you are an author that has the pressure to publish other bits, a monograph or a journal article. You normally push this chapter all the way down your priorities list. So it's very understandable from the perspective of authors who take their time. I would say that looking beyond what counts and what doesn't count, if you can afford that, I think that edited books are a very nice way to work with other peers. And these books often stem from maybe like a conference on the topic, or you may be familiar with the work of other authors and you want to maybe somehow develop a collaboration with them. And you think that they might make a nice contribution to the topic that you're thinking of. So if adequately executed, I think the end product can be very valuable. And also, I think that one important thing is that because nowadays you can upload your chapters online on SSRN or ResearchGate, etc., you can, of course, garner as much attention with a chapter than you can with an article. Of course, as I said, I think the big question is if you have time, the big if. But as I say, I think it is a valuable experience. And I would certainly say that I think especially from the perspective of maybe the networking, in the sense that it gives you an opportunity to maybe work with other people. And from that collaboration, you might develop maybe an article in the future. So I think in that sense, if you can look beyond what counts immediately for your faculty, it should be a nice experience. And if you can afford, the time, if you don't need something out by a specific deadline, because that's virtually impossible, as anyone who has published an edited book knows.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are all great points. I mean, one of the kind of justifications that I've heard put forward for not counting an edited book in kind of, performance appraisal and evaluation is, well, actually, there's not that much work involved, or, the quality of these edited collections is sometimes not very good. I mean, would you agree that that's just not really a valid justification? Because actually, from all the people I've spoken to, there is a lot of work involved. That's the first thing in, getting together all the contributors, approaching a publisher, ensuring editorial and thematic consistency, but also in terms of the quality point, any form of research output can vary in quality. You get good books, bad books, good edited books, bad edited books, good articles, bad articles. So to me, that just seems like a bit of a non-justification for failing to count edited books, right? I mean, would you agree with that assessment?
I think it's hard to understand just the amount of work that they entail unless you've actually done one yourself. And I think that, like you say, I think the hours that you spend editing, especially if you take pride in the product that's going to have your name on it. I mean, I don't really differentiate between submitting a chapter to an edited book or to a journal. I spend the same amount of time and I try to ensure that the quality is just as good. As I say, normally if I've written in an edited book, it's simply because I've had a nice invitation from someone and that I'm happy to work with, and I think that the topic is interesting and I want to delve into it a bit further. So yes, in that sense, absolutely. And yeah, as an editor, as I say, the amount of work, if you want to have a finalized, coherent product, tends to be colossal. So, I mean, I get the point that maybe sometimes, I'm sure, like you say, that there might be some edited books that are of worse quality, but I've also seen, some very, very solid pieces. And I'm sure we all frequently cite the work of chapters in edited collections that are very, very well put together, very thorough, very, very important, and make a very significant contribution to the field. I would say that's in my opinion anyway. But like you say, there is, I'm sure there is all kinds of quality.
Yeah, I mean, I think we might come back a little later because what I want to ask you later is, based on all the things we've kind of gone through, how do you kind of decide what types of research publication to actually generate? So I might come back to that, but I think it's just worth adding something now because I'll probably forget about it if I don't mention it now, which is that as far as engines like Google Scholar are concerned, and it's something I'll maybe come back to another time. I mean, I don't really like Google Scholar. I think it's often quite misleading in terms of citations. But one thing that I think there is at least some agreement on is that Google Scholar is less good at picking up, for example, book chapters than it is picking up journal articles. Now, again, it depends on what databases works might be published in. But I've personally found that books and book chapters are either not picked up at all or not adequately picked up by Google Scholar. And I regard it as so misleading, such a gross undercounting of citations of those works, that I don't make my Google Scholar profile public, because I think, well, why should someone think I've got this amount of citations for a given piece when actually, I've got a lot more. So maybe we can come back to that. But I wonder if we could talk a little bit about monographs versus textbooks. Obviously, it is recognized that these are different types of books, but could we just begin by thinking about whether we think the distinction between a monograph on the one hand and a textbook on the other, whether that is actually such a bright line, or is it more a difference in maybe degree rather than a difference in kind? I mean, do you think sometimes that dichotomy, not as a false dichotomy, but perhaps an overstated dichotomy?
I mean, of course, I guess it depends on the nature of the textbook and the nature of the monograph. Very generally speaking, and going by my own experience, I would say that a monograph is normally, as I said earlier, a chance to really explore every aspect of a relatively narrow topic, let's say. And it can be very enjoyable or perhaps very burdensome, depending on how much you enjoy research. I think you really need to like to do research, to have the patience to actually write such a book. Of course, once it's in print, it's such a huge satisfaction, and even more if others read it and enjoy it. I think that what is most important is that it gives you an opportunity to let your voice be heard and maybe change or make a lasting impact on the subject matter. So what I would say, if I compare that to a textbook, if I think of my own textbook, for instance, my monograph would be like a chapter. The topic is like a chapter of that textbook. So the textbook is much broader. And I would say that's probably the case in most instances. But again, I guess that it depends on each case. So what I feel is that, of course, taking up a textbook is a huge task. And it's normally perhaps the breadth that is quite daunting. So normally when we are conducting research, we are focused on a very specific area, like if you write a monograph or an article, and suddenly you are forced to look at your entire subject, every single aspect, things that you mightn't have touched on for a while. And you need to make sure that your knowledge on that topic is up to date. You need to, of course, to explain it to the students, you need to understand it very well yourself. So you really need to effectively study to ensure that you cover everything adequately. So and I think that perhaps another issue is, as I said earlier, is that when I'm writing the textbook, especially in my case, my textbook is for somebody who's just getting acquainted with the subject. So I'm really perhaps I'm thinking of the students, and I'm adopting maybe a different approach, a more basic, more didactic approach, perhaps. Trying to explain, the developments to date on each aspect that the textbook covers. So I think those would be the main differences that I would highlight.
You've made a really great point there about the kind of the daunting aspects of the breadth of textbooks. And when you said that, I just immediately thought about one of my books, which I think is regarded as a textbook. I think we all have our own different fields of specialism, but even within those, there are subjects or topics that we're more comfortable with than others, right? For one of the chapters in that book, I'm not going to say which one, because then people are going to go and try and find it. So I'll leave people guessing. But I remember thinking, goodness, I have to write a chapter about this topic. And this topic, it's just a nightmare. I mean, there's so much disagreement on the basic doctrinal aspects of that subject. Even judges, right, we're both in law, even judges really struggle to kind of formulate that subject. Some people who know me will know exactly what I'm talking about here. But, having to put together a chapter on that means that you have to but you have to ensure that your competence and your familiarity and the extent to which you're conversant with that subject matter is good enough to go into print, right? The breadth absolutely is daunting. I mean, I think it's interesting, the point about audience. So, for example, one of my books, Administrative Law in Hong Kong, and I think it's regarded as a textbook, but actually there is an English book. I don't want to say I was modeling it on that book. I think that book was more of an inspiration, which has gone through multiple editions over a couple of decades, and actually is really regarded as setting the tone for that subject. Now, I'm not saying that my book does that. I mean, that's what I would aspire to. But it's even used a lot by judges, and it gets a lot of court citations too. For me, that's something which I think slightly blurs this line, though, between monographs and textbooks, because definitely I had the students in mind, but also I was trying to see whether I could make this useful to maybe judges as well, in the hope that I could get maybe some judicial citations and to influence the law there. I mean, did you also have that in mind? Did you also think about like kind of the broader impact that your textbook might have in terms of, influencing or even setting the landscape and the lie of the land within your subject area?
Of course. I mean, I think that clearly the textbook is an opportunity to talk to the students, and often I know that probably we both also think of producing something that the students can use and can learn from. And I think since we are often so focused on very specific and maybe very doctrinal research, this is sometimes a breath of fresh air. And I found also it helped me connect with the students, because sometimes they give me feedback on what works, what doesn't work, some feature that they might like added, etc. And sometimes I've really made changes on the basis of what they've said to me. But of course, you always want to have a broader impact, sure. And whenever we write, we have our opinions, and our voice is heard even through our textbooks. That's clear. And absolutely, your book can have, of course, a wider audience beyond your students. I just think that, as a general, as a very general rule, normally we would, yes, I would say that normally a monograph, because of if you adopt, let's say, a topic that is narrow enough, it will enable you to really explore every little detail in a way that you might not be able to do in a textbook, even maybe other jurisdictions. So for instance, what I found in my textbook, it relates to EU, UK. So sometimes I make some references to the US or China, but I can't really engage in very in-depth comparative analysis, which is something that perhaps a monograph would allow you to undertake. So normally, yes, I agree with you that the line is blurred. As I say, in my case, perhaps less so. But yes, absolutely. You want to produce, when you write a textbook, you want to produce something that will be citable, like you say, by courts, etc. And another thing I would say is, you say textbooks don't count. I mean, new editions, I think, are even more problematic. And oftentimes, if you work in a field like mine, and I'm guessing yours as well, that every time you write a new edition, there is hundreds of relevant cases and maybe new legislation, new guidelines, a new institutional framework, as was the case for my last edition. This is not rewriting or updating. This is really just writing something new almost. So the amount of work that goes into that is just something very, very maybe hard to grasp if you haven't written a textbook before. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And the case that kind of springs to my mind is a book that I'm doing a second edition of with someone else. I wasn't in the first edition, but the original co-author is no longer living. So I've been invited to kind of contribute to the second edition. And in that book, there is going to be it's UK public law, but there's a chapter in there which, fortunately, is not my chapter, on how EU law integrates with the UK. And I said to my co-author, "What are you going to do?" And he said, "I don't know," because of course, you're faced with deadlines from publishers and whatnot, and that, of course, has been a major state of flux, within the UK and its relationship with the EU. I mean, it's a little bit more settled now, but a year, 2 years ago, it's kind of losing track of time with COVID, of course. But, in the last 1 or 2 years, it's been so hard to predict, what's going to happen there. And you could literally write that chapter and then something could happen, in domestic and international politics or the Brexit negotiations that were going on. And you might literally have to put that chapter in the bin and start again. So that is super tough. I mean, I think in law, obviously some areas of law change or are modified with more frequency than others. I hope I'm not doing a disservice to, history or philosophy or those kinds of areas, but I just get the sense, and I'm sure people will leave comments to say that I'm wrong on this, I get the sense that they just don't have that same degree of turnover in material. But then law's not necessarily unique in that regard. I guess, a lot of the physical sciences might be similar in that respect. You mentioned textbooks, Sandra, and we spoke a little bit about this before the interview, right? Textbooks also, in some institutions, are not counted at all as far as research outputs are concerned. Or I've seen situations where an institution has said, well, you can count this towards your teaching contribution, but you cannot count it as research. Now, I don't want to prejudge or preempt what we have to say about this, but I don't think either of us think that's a good thing, right? Why might we think that's not a good thing?
Well, of course, I can only give you my opinion, and of course, as the author of a textbook, I would be happy if they counted more. There is a clear risk if you're thinking of what counts. Again, there is a clear risk that updating a textbook will take up a lot of your research time. And this will mean, less articles, less monographs, and the stuff that really counts. And we said, how difficult it is because of the breadth. My book is competition law of the EU and UK. So exactly like what you're saying, I didn't really know which way things were going to go. And I left a lot of things open. And the last edition came out in 2019, we really didn't know anything of what was going to happen. So absolutely, I know just how nerve-wracking that can be as an author of a textbook. So I would say that perhaps, yes, of course, performance appraisals are extremely important, and I wouldn't recommend especially to early career academics, to disregard them in any way, of course. I would also say, they're not everything. I don't want to forget why I became an academic. I became an academic because, of course, I love doing research, but I also wanted to teach and engage with the students. And I think that the textbook is precisely an opportunity to do that. And like you said, a teaching experience like no other, and especially because the textbook is on a subject that I'm fortunate enough to teach. So I am able to maybe change it as taking into account what my students say, but also to really use it and to really discuss the issues with them and to really see the value of having what I think is a useful teaching tool for them. So as I say, for me, that is important. And I also think, and you might also have experienced this, it's quite nice when years down the line, you meet someone in the legal profession who says, yes, I studied this subject using your textbook. And, students will always associate normally your name with that subject. And that's very sweet, I think. And as I say, and plus for me, I really was very grateful for the opportunity to really keep on top of everything. And again, it's helpful when you teach. Plus, another thing that I found was that actually sometimes, because you have to look at aspects of your subject that you might not have particularly researched in the past, what I found was that you sometimes encounter interesting aspects. So by way of example, last year I published an article which was motivated by a new chapter that I was asked to write for one of the editions of the textbook. So it was not something that I'd necessarily worked on before in great depth. And I realized that it was truly fascinating, that it deserves greater attention, and something came out of that. So of course there are advantages. It's really what you make of it as well, I guess. And it's certainly an amazing experience. I also have to say that, a bit like you, the textbook. So I've been in charge of the 7th and 8th editions. So it's a textbook that was previously written by a former colleague of mine in Glasgow. If I had maybe had to decide whether to take on a textbook from scratch, that would have been, especially because I only got tenure in 2019, and I've been writing textbooks since 2010. So it might have been too much to take on. So it's now maybe that I have more time. But again, I thought maybe, well, it's a question of updating. And perhaps I didn't realize just what I was getting myself into, because you have to do a lot more than that, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think I totally agree with you that you're right. One should not always approach these things in terms of what, counts and what doesn't, not least because what, counts for one institution might not count in another. There's that aspect. I mean, I think the thing that really concerns me is that if you do have an institution which says either a textbook doesn't count in terms of how you're evaluated, or it counts for less than, say, a monograph, I think my concern is that this really disincentivizes people who are specialists in the subject from writing textbooks. Again, the justification I've heard is that, the quality is somehow lower or something. I just don't buy this. I think in every form of research output, there are variations in quality, and I don't kind of buy into this idea that some types of outputs are automatically, better or worse than others. The problem can end up being, of course, that you end up with a lack of textbooks, or a lack of good textbooks, because people don't want to invest too much time in them because they don't feel they're going to get the proper recognition from their own institution for writing those. So that then is not really promoting the interests of the students, if either no textbooks are coming through, or textbooks of insufficient quality are coming through. But I agree with you. For me, and apparently for you too, it is not totally discounted the advantages or the attractions of writing textbooks, the opportunity to make your mark on a subject, to affect the landscape of it, affect the scope of it, and to kind of put the tone of your research and your expertise into that. But yeah, I mean, I'm not really persuaded that institutions should be differentiating between different types of books, be them monographs or textbooks. I would maybe prefer to see maybe some form of peer review being used to speak to the quality of an output, rather than just kind of these kind of bland categorizations. But that's only my view on that. Sandra, there's one other thing to ask you here, and you're the second person I've interviewed in this channel, so you've got a slight advantage over my previous guest, who was the first. But the one question I'm going to put to everyone, and I did give you a heads up, so you've had some time to think about it, is if you could change one thing about academia, what would that thing be?
So I guess for me, and this is probably how I live academia personally, it's probably the writing guilt, I would say. So I guess because of the importance that is placed on research, your work potentially never ends. You could always be writing another piece. So there's always that feeling that you could be doing more. So sometimes I guess that can affect your enjoyment of your family time, your leisurely time. So I wish it were somehow easier maybe to close the door and turn off the computer and the brain really and disconnect. I find that is sometimes increasingly hard, especially I guess if we are doing, you know, textbooks and monographs and articles, etc., and you're trying to juggle everything that counts and that counts a bit less, etc.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'm amazed to hear that even someone of your level of, you know, productivity, even looking at the output, still feels like they haven't done enough. One thing that really I don't find particularly helpful is you will have seen some institutions, and I don't think your institution does this, and actually a lot of institutions don't, but I think we've all seen staff profile pages on websites of some institutions where beneath the person's name or credentials, they have a little graph, a little kind of vertical bar graph, which shows the number of outputs per year over time. And this is supposed to be a kind of snapshot of the person's productivity. I just think I just don't like that at all. We have no idea how those outputs are being counted, right? You're talking about updating textbooks, which can be a major undertaking. Well, imagine that doesn't count in that institution. It's not going to appear on the bar graph. Or, you know, if you're doing edited collections and timing is out with your control, as it is even sometimes with sole authored work, you might end up with a year which has nothing showing on the little bar on the chart, implying that you were just not productive with your research that year. But then the next year, you know, the bar could be huge because you had a really productive year. I mean, do you find that kind of device, I mean, it's just one example, right? But does that kind of add to that sense that there's a certain amount that I need to be doing here, even as kind of, even in the opinion of kind of third parties who don't really know how much work is involved? Or do those types of things not really bother you?
I think, I mean, it is also difficult for faculties to measure our performance, I assume. So, and there is, in general, they're also under pressure to have staff that produce good research. And, you know, a certain amount of research. It's all extremely important for us as academics to grow, etc. I mean, let's not underestimate the importance of publications and what they do to us, and also how, you know, we are able to disseminate our findings, but also how much we learn every time we write something. So I guess that this is, you know, each faculty has a different way of looking at this. I assume, I mean, in my experience, I mean, faculties also do listen. I mean, we are faculty, right? We are parts. We are also a part of the whole. And if you talk to your peers, I mean, I find that they're normally quite understanding. And you explain, well, I'm now working on this, and this is a longer term project. They can be, of course, they can say, yes, this is, of course, worth spending your time on, and you should, of course, focus on that. So I think it's all, they are understanding, they are willing to listen, and they are willing to consider that, you know, one year you might have 5 outputs, and then another year you might have 0. And that might be because you are preparing a monograph or a bigger project. So I do think that at the end of the day, they tend to listen and to consider these things. But I guess, of course, each institution will be different in this regard.
Yeah, just one final question for you. I'm kind of intrigued to find out the answer to this. I mean, you've referenced this idea of like writer's guilt, and that you don't really feel that you're, you know, doing enough, or you can always be doing more. When did you start to feel that? I mean, is that something that you've always felt in your career as an academic? Or did it just kick in at some point, or has that intensified? I mean, how has that developed during your academic career?
I mean, I think that I'm not only speaking on my behalf, because I think we hear this a lot. It's quite often. I guess that, you know, even as a PhD student, right, you think that you can always write a few more pages for your PhD, or you can always do a bit more, or you could always be doing this article in addition, or you can always have that idea that there's more out there that you could be doing. So I guess that it is, I would say it's part of academia. And of course, we enjoy our research, and there is a huge reward involved. So, I mean, of course, it's something that we live with, and I'm very happy that I have the chance to let my voice be heard, and that other peers sometimes enjoy what I write, and that my students also hopefully find it useful, and students around the world hopefully. And so, of course, there is already a huge reward in that regard. So, of course, I would say that it's still that thing that maybe in other jobs, especially for people who have practiced, that they have that feeling that, of course, sometimes they can be in the office all night. And there's another kind of pressure, and it's extremely difficult to be, a practitioner or an in-house lawyer, extremely difficult in many, many ways. But at the end of the day, when that case is finished that you're working on, you can, kind of shut the door and it's done. Whereas, for us, there's always that we could be doing something more. So that is, I think, what is attached, the specific thing about our profession, I would say.
Yeah, and that's really a nice optimistic and positive note to end on. I think you're right that one of the really precious things about being an academic is you get to choose, the research that you want to actually conduct. And some, of course, there are time issues and resource and capacity issues, but ultimately you get to choose what you want to research. And you refer to practicing lawyers. Often they don't get to choose the cases that they're involved with, right? Even though those specialisms might develop. Sandra, I'm so grateful for your time. Your insights have been fantastic. And I'm really grateful that you've joined us for this second episode of such a young channel on YouTube.
Thank you again for the opportunity and for the invitation, Stephen.
Thank you, Sandra. Thanks so much. So that was Dr. Sandra Marco Colino discussing with me the many different types of research publications which are out there. And I hope that gives you some sense on how these different types of publications are differentiated from each other. And also that, for example, the distinction between a monograph and a textbook is perhaps not as straightforward as we might expect. And also that you have to bear in mind institutional considerations about what counts and what doesn't. Although, as Dr. Colino said, and I fully agree with her, you shouldn't just do everything and make all of your decisions about what you do in your academic career based solely on institutional expectations. You also have to do what is valuable and what is meaningful for you. I hope you found that interesting. Please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video if you found this useful. And if you know someone else who could find these videos useful, perhaps a PhD student or an earlier mid-career researcher, please consider informing them about the channel. We'd really like to have your input, and also leave your comments below the video. Do you agree with what we had to say? Do you disagree? I don't just need agreement. Disagreement's absolutely welcome too. Also consider sharing your experiences and perhaps other perspectives we did not mention in this video. It's great to have you looking in, and I'm hoping you'll join us in another episode of That's Academic. Thanks, and bye for now.